"Pull the trigger," she whispered, her voice steady as granite while the cold steel of the rifle barrel pressed against her temple. The words hung in the crisp morning air of Fort Blackwater's training grounds, like a challenge nobody expected. Cadet Marcus Thorne's finger hovered over the trigger of what he believed was just another training weapon. His smirk widening as 23 other cadets formed a semicircle around them, their laughter echoing off the concrete walls of the tactical simulation building. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The woman kneeling before him appeared unremarkable, average height, maybe 35 years old. Wearing the standard issue gray trainee uniform with no insignia, no rank. Nothing to distinguish her from the dozens of civilian contractors who rotated through Fort Blackwater every month. Her dark brown hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and her hazel eyes stared straight ahead, unflinching, as if the weapon aimed at her skull was nothing more than a pointed finger. "You heard her, Thorne," shouted Cadet Rivera from somewhere behind the circle. "She's practically begging for it." "Maybe she's into this kind of thing," added Cadet Walsh, his voice dripping with cruel amusement. "Some people get off on the fear." But there was no fear in her posture. Her hands rested calmly on her thighs, her breathing was controlled and measured, and her expression held the same neutral intensity of someone waiting for a bus. This wasn't the reaction Marcus had expected when he'd singled her out during what was supposed to be a routine weapons safety demonstration. The morning had started like any other. Tuesday, at the prestigious military academy. Colonel Henderson had introduced their new observer, some Pentagon bureaucrat named Sarah Chun, who would be evaluating their tactical readiness for the next 2 weeks. She'd sat quietly in the back corner of the briefing room, taking notes on a tablet, asking no questions, making no comments. Just another desk jockey trying to justify her paycheck by watching real soldiers train, or so they thought, when they'd moved to the outdoor simulation course. Marcus had noticed how she'd volunteered to play the role of a captured asset in their hostage rescue scenario. Most civilian observers declined field participation, preferring to watch from the safety of the observation deck. But she'd stepped forward without hesitation, even as Lieutenant Brooks explained that the exercise involved simulated interrogation techniques and could get psychologically intense. "I can handle it," she'd said simply, her voice carrying a quiet confidence that Marcus had immediately wanted to test. That's when he'd gotten the idea. The training rifles were loaded with blanks, completely harmless but realistic, enough to make most people flinch when aimed at their head. It was a game the senior cadets played sometimes with new recruits, a way to separate the weak from the strong. Point the weapon, watch them beg or cry or freeze up, then laugh about it later in the barracks. But Sarah Chun wasn't reacting like a frightened civilian. She wasn't reacting like anyone Marcus had ever encountered. "What's wrong, Marcus?" called out Cadet Thompson, sensing his hesitation. "Don't tell me you're getting cold feet, too." The other cadets erupted in fresh laughter. These were the elite future officers who'd graduated top of their class from the nation's most competitive military academies. They'd been handpicked for Fort Blackwater's Advanced Tactical Leadership Program, each one destined for rapid promotion and prestigious assignments. They were young, brilliant, and absolutely convinced of their own superiority, which made their treatment of support staff, contractors, and anyone they perceived as beneath them particularly vicious. In their minds, they were apex predators, and everyone else was prey. Marcus pressed the rifle barrel harder against Sarah's temple, feeling the need to reassert his dominance. "I said pull the trigger," she repeated, this time loud enough for everyone to hear. "Or are you waiting for written permission?" The insult landed like a slap. Several cadets whooped and hollered, sensing blood in the water. Marcus felt his face flush red beneath his combat helmet. "You think this is funny?" He snarled, leaning closer until his breath fogged her ear. "You think we're playing some kind of game here?" "I think," Sarah said, her voice carrying just loud enough for the entire group to hear, "that you're about to learn something very important about making assumptions." Something in her tone made Marcus pause. There was no tremor, no fear, no pleading, just a calm certainty that sent an unexpected chill down his spine. For a split second, he wondered if maybe this wasn't such a good idea after all. But then Cadet Rivera started chanting, "Do it! Do it! Do it!" And the others joined in, their voices building to a crescendo that drowned out any second thoughts. This was about reputation now, about proving he had the stones to follow through. Marcus Thorne had no way of knowing that the woman kneeling before him had spent 8 years as a Navy SEAL, including 3 tours in active combat zones. He didn't know about the classified missions in Syria and Afghanistan, or the Medal of Honor citation that was buried so deep in Pentagon files that it might as well not exist. He couldn't see the surgical scars hidden beneath her civilian clothes. Souvenirs from firefights in places that didn't officially appear on any map. All he saw was prey. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. All she saw was an opportunity. "Last chance to back down," Sarah whispered, so quietly that only Marcus could hear. But instead of backing down, Marcus Thorne tightened his grip on the rifle and prepared to squeeze the trigger, completely unaware that he was about to discover why you never, ever threaten a Navy SEAL. The chanting grew louder as more cadets pushed forward, forming a tighter circle around Marcus and Sarah. What had started as a spontaneous act of cruelty was quickly becoming a group spectacle. Each young man eager to prove his loyalty to the pack by encouraging the escalation. "Come on, Thorne. What are you waiting for?" Cadet Jake Morrison stepped closer, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd never been told no. At 6'3", with the build of a linebacker, Morrison was the unofficial leader of the advanced tactical class, the kind of natural alpha that other cadets gravitated toward. His father was a 3-star general. His grandfather had stormed Normandy, and Morrison himself had never encountered a problem that couldn't be solved with aggression and privilege. "Yeah, Marcus," added Cadet Brian Kovac, a wiry kid from Boston whose acceptance to Fort Blackwater had more to do with his senator mother's influence than his actual qualifications. "Don't tell me you're going soft on some Pentagon paper pusher." The group dynamics were toxic and well established. These weren't ordinary military cadets. They were the sons of generals, congressmen, defense contractors, and old money families who'd been buying their way into positions of power for generations. Fort Blackwater's advanced program was supposed to fast-track them to leadership positions, but somewhere along the way, the institution had become a breeding ground for entitled bullies who confused authority with brutality. Cadet David Kim, whose tech billionaire father had donated millions to the academy, pulled out his phone and started recording. "This is going to be epic," he said, angling for the best shot. "My followers are going to love this." "Put that away, Kim," Morrison barked, but not out of any sense of decency. He just didn't want evidence. Some things are better kept between brothers. The cadets all wore the same expression, a mixture of excitement and cruelty that comes from pack hunting. They'd been doing this for months, targeting anyone they perceived as weak or inferior. Visiting instructors, support staff, even younger cadets who didn't fit their narrow definition of acceptable. The administration either didn't know or didn't care, too focused on the prestigious reputations of their students' families to investigate complaints that always seemed to disappear into bureaucratic black holes. "Remember that contractor last month?" laughed Cadet Tyler Brooks, a blond kid from Texas whose drawl made everything sound like an insult. "The one who started crying when we made him crawl through the mud?" "Or that female instructor who quit after one day," added Cadet Alex Chun, no relation to Sarah, despite the shared surname. Said we were psychologically disturbing or some bullshit like that. The stories flowed freely now, each cadet trying to top the others with tales of humiliation and cruelty. They'd perfected the art of psychological warfare against anyone they deemed unworthy of respect. Mock executions, forced degradation, elaborate pranks that crossed every line of human decency, all disguised as training exercises or team building. "This one's different though," observed Cadet Ryan Murphy, studying Sarah's completely calm demeanor with genuine puzzlement. "Most people are begging by now." "That's what makes it better," Morrison replied, his smile cold and predatory. "The quiet ones always break the hardest when they finally snap." They were wrong about many things, but Morrison was particularly wrong about Sarah Chun. She wasn't quiet because she was broken or afraid. She was quiet because she was conducting her own assessment. In the span of 3 minutes, she'd cataloged the group's hierarchy, identified the leaders and followers, analyzed their psychological profiles, and calculated approximately 17 different ways to neutralize the threat if necessary. But more importantly, she was learning. This wasn't just random cruelty. It was systematic, organized, and clearly tolerated by the command structure. These cadets had been operating with impunity for months, possibly years, creating a culture of abuse that would follow them into their future leadership positions. Unless, of course, someone taught them a lesson they'd never forget. "You know what I think?" said Cadet Chris Rodriguez, the group's amateur philosopher who always had theories about everything. "I think she's in shock. Like psychological shutdown. Her brain can't process the threat, so she's just ... frozen." "Nah," countered Cadet Mike Stevens, whose father owned half the defense contractors in Virginia. "She's probably one of those feminist types who thinks she can stare us down with some kind of girl power nonsense." The laughter that followed was sharp and ugly, the sound of young men who'd never faced real consequences for their actions. They'd grown up in a bubble of privilege and power, told from birth that they were destined for greatness, that rules applied to other people, that their family names and trust funds made them untouchable. Fort Blackwater was supposed to teach them leadership, honor, and sacrifice. Instead, it had become a finishing school for sociopaths. "All right, enough talking," Morrison finally declared, stepping behind Marcus and placing a hand on his shoulder. "Time to see what this lady is really made of. Show her what happens when civilians try to play in our world." The circle tightened again. 23 faces eager for entertainment, completely unaware that they were about to receive an education in a subject that wasn't covered in any of their textbooks. The difference between playing soldier and being a warrior. Sarah Chun remained perfectly still, her breathing controlled, her pulse steady. She'd faced down enemy combatants in Syrian strongholds and Afghan mountain passes. She'd survived firefights that would have sent these privileged children running home to their mothers. A group of untested cadets with daddy issues and superiority complexes. This was going to be educational. The silence that followed Morrison's declaration was deafening, but not in the way the cadets expected. They were used to their victims breaking at this point. Tears, pleas for mercy, desperate attempts to negotiate or explain. Instead, Sarah Chun sat with the stillness of a predator waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Though to the untrained eyes surrounding her, she appeared to be nothing more than a terrified civilian frozen in shock. Marcus felt sweat beginning to form under his tactical gear, despite the cool October morning at Fort Blackwater. The rifle in his hands, a standard issue M4 carbine loaded with training blanks, suddenly felt heavier than it should. There was something unsettling about the woman's complete lack of reaction that he couldn't quite put his finger on. In all their previous games, the targets had at least shown some sign of distress by now, elevated breathing, trembling hands, darting eyes looking for escape routes. Sarah showed none of these signs. Her hands remained relaxed on her thighs, fingers slightly curved in what Marcus didn't recognize as a combat-ready position. Her breathing was so controlled, it was barely perceptible. The kind of respiratory discipline that takes years to master under extreme stress. Most telling of all, her eyes weren't darting around looking for help. They were focused straight ahead with the 1,000-yard stare of someone who'd seen real combat, but Marcus had never seen real combat. None of them had. The closest any of these cadets had come to actual danger was a hazing incident the previous semester that had sent one recruit to the hospital with a dislocated shoulder. They were tourists in the world of military service, playing dress-up in uniforms their trust funds had bought them access to. "Maybe she's deaf," suggested Cadet Kim, still holding his phone despite Morrison's earlier warning. "Like, physically can't hear what's happening." "She heard Marcus talking to her earlier," countered Cadet Walsh. "Responded and everything. She's just playing some kind of mind game." Cadet Rodriguez, ever the armchair psychologist, offered another theory. It's called dissociation. When trauma gets too intense, the mind just checks out, leaves the body behind to deal with whatever's happening. The cadets nodded sagely, as if Rodriguez had just revealed some profound military wisdom, instead of half-remembered fragments from an introductory psychology course his tutor had helped him pass. They genuinely believed they were witnessing a psychological breakdown, that their sophisticated intimidation tactics had achieved the desired effect of rendering their target catatonic with fear. They couldn't have been more wrong. Sarah's apparent stillness was actually a masterclass in tactical assessment. In the 3 minutes since Marcus had pressed the rifle to her head, she'd cataloged every relevant detail of her environment. The training yard was approximately 50 meters square, surrounded by concrete walls on 3 sides with the main building forming the 4th boundary. 2 exits, the main gate they'd entered through and an emergency door leading back into the administration building. She'd counted 24 hostiles in total, 23 cadets plus Marcus, all wearing standard training gear but carrying no additional weapons beyond the single rifle currently pointed at her head. Their formation was sloppy, clustered too close together, leaving multiple blind spots and creating the perfect conditions for what special operations forces called catastrophic tactical surprise. More importantly, she'd assessed their psychological profiles. These weren't hardened soldiers or experienced fighters. They were privileged children playing with expensive toys. Their body language screamed inexperience, weight distributed incorrectly, attention focused on entertainment rather than security. No one watching the perimeter or maintaining situational awareness beyond the immediate spectacle. In her 8 years as a Navy SEAL, Sarah had infiltrated terrorist cells in Mosul, extracted high-value targets from Taliban strongholds, and survived firefights against enemies who'd been learning to kill since they were old enough to hold weapons. The idea that she might be intimidated by a group of trust fund babies with military cosplay fantasies would have been laughable if it weren't so insulting. But what bothered her most wasn't their amateur hour intimidation tactics, it was what their behavior revealed about the systematic failure of the culture of the institution that was supposed to be training America's future military leaders. These cadets weren't learning honor, discipline, or the sacred responsibility that came with the uniform. They were learning that power meant the right to abuse those they perceived as weaker. That authority was a license for cruelty, and that their privileged backgrounds made them untouchable. "I think she's praying," observed Cadet Brooks, misinterpreting Sarah's focused breathing as some form of religious ritual. "Probably asking God to save her or something." "God can't help you here, lady," Marcus said, trying to inject more menace into his voice. "This is our house, our rules." The irony was lost on him entirely. If Sarah had been praying, which she wasn't, it wouldn't have been for salvation. It would have been for restraint. The training scenario she designed for actual Navy SEAL teams involved neutralizing multiple armed hostiles in confined spaces, often while bound or otherwise disadvantaged. Taking down 24 untrained cadets would have been a warm-up exercise, barely worth mentioning in an after-action report. But she wasn't here as a Navy SEAL, officially. She was Sarah Chun, Pentagon analyst, conducting a routine evaluation of training protocols. Her real mission was far more complex, investigating reports of systematic abuse within the Advanced Tactical Program. Reports that had been mysteriously buried or dismissed every time they reached higher command levels. Someone with serious political connections was protecting these cadets, ensuring their behavior never faced real consequences. Sarah's job was to document the extent of the problem and gather evidence that couldn't be swept under the rug by well-connected families. She'd expected to find some degree of inappropriate conduct. Hazing was unfortunately common in military training environments. She hadn't expected to find a culture so toxic it bordered on sociopathic. The rifle barrel pressed harder against her temple as Marcus grew more frustrated with her lack of response. In his limited experience, this was usually the moment victims broke completely, when the psychological pressure became too much to bear. He'd never encountered someone who'd been trained to compartmentalize fear, to function effectively under stress that would paralyze ordinary civilians. "Last chance," Marcus said, his voice carrying a tremor that betrayed his own nervousness. "Beg me to stop and maybe I'll consider it." Sarah's lips curved into the faintest suggestion of a smile, not from fear, not from madness, but from the grim amusement of a professional recognizing an amateur's mistake. Marcus had just given her explicit permission to end this charade whenever she chose. She continued to wait, letting them dig their hole deeper, gathering more evidence of behavior that would be impossible for their influential families to explain away. Every word, every action, every moment of cruelty was being mentally recorded for the comprehensive report that would end more than just their military careers. The cadets interpreted her continued silence as victory, not recognizing the calm before the storm that was about to change their lives forever. The pack mentality that had been simmering beneath the surface finally erupted into full display as the cadets grew bolder with Sarah's continued silence. What had started as Marcus's impulsive power play was rapidly evolving into a group-feeding frenzy, each young man desperate to prove his dominance over what they perceived as a helpless victim. "You know what? I don't think she can hear you, Marcus," Cadet Morrison declared, stepping forward until he was close enough that Sarah could smell the expensive cologne he wore beneath his tactical gear. "Maybe we need to get her attention a different way." Without warning, Morrison clapped his hands together inches from Sarah's face, the sharp sound echoing off the concrete walls like a gunshot. Most people would have flinched, blinked, or shown some instinctive startle response. Sarah's eyes didn't even shift in his direction. "Damn," laughed Cadet Stevens, "she really is gone. Like completely checked out." "This is better than I thought," added Cadet Murphy, his voice carrying the excited edge of someone witnessing a car accident. "We broke her without even doing anything yet." The comments grew progressively more vicious as the cadets fed off each other's energy. Cadet Kim had resumed recording despite Morrison's earlier objections, angling his phone to capture Sarah's face as the others took turns, trying to provoke a reaction. "Hey lady," Cadet Walsh called out in a sing-song voice. "Remember when you thought you were tough enough to hang with real soldiers? She probably thought she was going to come in here and show us how it's done," added Cadet Rodriguez with mock sympathy. "Bet she's regretting that decision now." Cadet Brooks, emboldened by the group's escalating cruelty, decided to take things further. He walked behind Sarah and placed his hands on her shoulders, leaning down to whisper directly in her ear. "You know what happens to people who don't know their place around here." Sarah felt the cadet's breath on her neck and had to consciously suppress her body's strain. response to neutralize what it recognized as a threat position. In actual combat, someone approaching from behind and making physical contact would have been disabled before they could complete their sentence. But this wasn't combat, this was intelligence gathering. And every second of their behavior was providing valuable evidence for her eventual report. Still, she filed away the tactical information. Brooks favored his right side, had no awareness of proper defensive positioning, and was completely vulnerable to approximately 6 different disabling techniques. Just in case. I asked you a question, Brooks continued when Sarah didn't respond, his hands tightening on her shoulders. Don't you think it's rude to ignore someone who's trying to talk to you? The physical contact seemed to break some invisible barrier among the group. What had been verbal intimidation was now escalating to actual assault. Though the cadets were too caught up in their power trip to recognize the legal implications of what they were doing. Maybe she needs a lesson in respect, suggested Cadet Chun, his voice carrying the casual cruelty of someone who'd never faced consequences for his actions. My dad always said the best way to train someone is through negative reinforcement. The mention of his father, a tech mogul whose defense contracts had made him a billionaire, reminded everyone present of the protective umbrella that shielded them from accountability. These weren't ordinary military cadets who could be disciplined through normal channels. They were the children of senators, generals, CEOs, and political dynasties. Their families had enough influence to make problems disappear and careers vanish, or so they believed. You know what would be really funny? Cadet Kovac said, his Boston accent making the word sound even more menacing. If we made her crawl around the yard on her hands and knees, like a dog. The suggestion was met with enthusiastic approval from the group. They'd done this before, forced contractors, visiting instructors, and support staff to perform degrading acts for their amusement. It was a signature move, something that humiliated victims while providing plausible deniability if anyone complained. Just cadets being cadets, blowing off steam, nothing serious. Brilliant, Morrison said, his leadership instincts kicking in as he sensed an opportunity to cement his position as alpha. Brooks, get her on the ground. Time for this Pentagon princess to learn some humility. Cadet Brooks began applying downward pressure on Sarah's shoulders, trying to force her into a prone position. This was the moment when most of their previous victims would have broken. Completely. The transition from psychological intimidation to physical domination was usually too much for civilian contractors to handle, but Sarah wasn't most people's. Brooks pushed down on her shoulders. She allowed her body to move with the pressure rather than resist it, using the momentum to shift into what appeared to be a submissive position, but was actually a tactical crouch. To the untrained cadets, it looked like compliance. To someone with Sarah's background, it was preparation. There we go, Brooks said triumphantly, interpreting her movement as surrender. Finally learning your place. Marcus, still holding the rifle to what was now the back of Sarah's head, felt a surge of vindication. This was how it was supposed to work, their superior will imposing itself on inferior people who needed to understand the natural order of things. Now crawl, Morrison commanded, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. All the way to the fence and back. And while you're doing it, I want you to think about whether you still believe you belong in our world. The other cadets formed the gauntlet, ready to hurl insults and record the humiliation for their private entertainment. This was their masterpiece, the culmination of months of increasingly bold behavior that had gone unchecked by an administration too concerned with donor relations to investigate allegations of abuse. They had no idea they were about to discover the difference between authority and actual power. Sarah remained motionless for a moment longer, letting the full extent of their cruelty reveal itself. Every word, every action, every moment of sadistic pleasure was being catalogued for the report that would end their military careers and potentially land several of them in military prison, but more than that. She was allowing them to cross every possible line so that what happened next would be completely justified under any standard of self-defense or protection of others. They weren't just abusing her, they were demonstrating a pattern of behavior that posed a clear and present danger to every future subordinate they might command. Marcus pressed the rifle barrel harder against her skull, misinterpreting her stillness as defeat. "You heard the man. Start crawling." The moment had arrived. 24 privileged bullies had just threatened, assaulted, and attempted to humiliate a decorated Navy SEAL who'd been documenting their crimes for a Pentagon investigation. Their education was about to begin. The autumn wind picked up across the training yard, carrying with it the scent of distant rain and the faint sounds of regular military exercises happening elsewhere on the Fort Blackwater complex. In other parts of the base, legitimate soldiers were conducting actual training, learning skills that would keep them alive in real combat, developing the discipline and honor that define true military service. But here, in this isolated corner of the Academy's most prestigious program, something entirely different was unfolding, something that was about to reveal truths none of these young men were prepared to face. The moment stretched like a taut wire. 24 pairs of eyes focused on what they believed was their latest victim's final surrender. Marcus felt the weight of the rifle in his hands, the cold metal of the barrel pressed against Sarah's skull, and experienced what he mistook for the intoxicating rush of absolute power. Behind him, his fellow cadets waited with predatory anticipation, smartphones ready to capture what they assumed would be another humiliating trophy for their private collection. But there was something in the air that none of them could quite identify, a shift in the atmosphere that made the morning seem suddenly electric with possibility. The birds that had been chattering in the nearby oak trees fell silent. Even the distant sounds of training exercises seemed to fade, as if the entire base was holding its breath for what was about to unfold. Sarah felt the change too, but for entirely different reasons. In her mind, she was no longer Sarah Chun, Pentagon analyst, observer of routine training protocols. The careful facade she'd maintained for 2 weeks of documentation and evidence gathering was about to fall away, revealing something these privileged children had never encountered in their sheltered lives. A predator that operated on an entirely different level than their amateur-hour intimidation tactics. The transformation began in her breathing. What the cadets had interpreted as fear-induced paralysis was actually the controlled respiratory pattern of a special operations warrior preparing for action. Each breath was measured, deliberate, oxygenating her blood and priming her nervous system for the explosive violence that her body had been trained to deliver with surgical precision. Her muscle tension shifted almost imperceptibly, invisible to the untrained eyes surrounding her, but dramatic in its implications. 8 years of Navy SEAL training had taught her to transition from apparent helplessness to lethal capability in milliseconds, to become a weapon disguised as a victim until the moment when survival demanded revelation. "What's she doing?" Cadet Kim whispered, his camera phone wavering slightly as he noticed something different in Sarah's posture. There was nothing he could point to specifically. She was still kneeling, still had the rifle pressed to her head, still appeared completely at their mercy. But something fundamental had changed in a way that made his survival instincts, dormant from years of privilege and safety, suddenly scream warnings his conscious mind couldn't interpret. Cadet Morrison, too focused on orchestrating the humiliation to notice the subtle shift, decided to escalate further. "I don't think she heard me," he said loudly, playing to his audience. "Maybe we need to make the instructions clearer." He reached into his tactical vest and pulled out a training knife, a rubberized blade designed for close quarters combat exercises. Like everything else at Fort Blackwater, it was expensive, authentic looking, and completely harmless. But in the hands of someone who'd never used a real weapon in actual combat, it felt dangerous and intimidating. "See this?" Morrison said, holding the training blade where Sarah could see it in her peripheral vision. "This is what happens to people who don't follow orders in the real world. Military discipline isn't a suggestion, it's a requirement." The irony was staggering. These cadets, who'd never faced a moment of genuine danger or discipline in their lives, were lecturing a decorated combat veteran about military standards while threatening her with toy weapons and recorded humiliation. They were children playing dress-up, mistaking expensive equipment for competence and family influence for actual authority. But they were about to learn that some lessons can't be bought with trust funds or political connections. Sarah's eyes, which had remained fixed straight ahead throughout the ordeal, finally shifted. Not to Morrison's rubber knife, not to the cameras recording their crime, not to the exit routes she'd already memorized. Instead, she turned her gaze upward, toward the American flag flying above the main administration building, its red, white, and blue fabric snapping in the wind like a battle standard dot for just a moment. Her expression softened with something that might have been sadness. Not fear, not anger, but the profound disappointment of someone who'd bled for that flag, who'd watched good people die defending what it represented, now witnessing its symbols being worn by spoiled children who understood nothing of service, sacrifice, or honor. The flag reminded her of Petty Officer Jackson, killed by an IED outside Kandahar while protecting Afghan civilians, of Lieutenant Commander Torres, who died holding a position long enough for his team to extract wounded hostages in Syria, of Chief Watson, Sarah's mentor and friend, who'd taught her that the uniform wasn't a costume but a sacred trust that demanded everything of those who wore it. These cadets wore the same uniform, carried the same rank insignia, claimed the same heritage. But they understood none of its meaning. That understanding crystallized something in Sarah's mind, a cold clarity that settled over her like armor. This wasn't just about stopping a group of bullies or gathering evidence for a Pentagon investigation. This was about defending the honor of everyone who'd ever worn the uniform with dignity, who'd understood that authority meant responsibility, that power meant protection of those who couldn't protect themselves. "Time's up, lady," Marcus said, his voice cracking slightly with nervous energy. "Start crawling, or we start getting creative with our training methods." The threat hung in the air like smoke, marking the exact moment when these privileged children crossed from harassment into something that would require immediate, decisive response. They'd threatened a Navy SEAL with weapons, recorded their assault for entertainment, and were now escalating to physical force. In the classified world Sarah normally inhabited, such behavior would have justified lethal response under the rules of engagement. Here, surrounded by American military cadets on American soil, she would settle for a more educational approach. But education she'd learned in the mountains of Afghanistan and the streets of Mosul sometimes required dramatic demonstrations. The wind died completely, leaving the training yard in perfect silence. 24 young men holding their breath, waiting for their victim's final surrender. One woman kneeling in apparent defeat, actually calculating the precise sequence of movements that would transform predators into prey in less time than it took to blink. The only sound was the distant snap of the American flag, flying over an institution that had forgotten what it was supposed to represent. That was about to change. The revelation began not with words, but with a single fluid motion that transformed everything the cadets thought they understood about power, training, and the woman kneeling before them. But before that motion came the truth, delivered in a voice so calm and controlled that it cut through their jeering like a blade through silk. "My name," Sarah said, her words carrying across the training yard with crystalline clarity, "is not Sarah Chun, Pentagon analyst." The laughter that had been building among the cadets died instantly. Something in her tone, not fear, not pleading, but absolute authority, commanded attention in a way that bypassed their conscious minds and spoke directly to primal survival instincts they'd never needed to develop. My name is Commander Sarah Victoria Chun, United States Navy SEALs, Special Operations Command. Classification Level Echo 7. The silence that followed was so complete that Marcus could hear his own heartbeat thundering in his ears. Classification Level Echo 7 didn't exist in any manual these cadets had studied, but the way she spoke the words carried the weight of absolute authenticity. This wasn't someone reciting memorized fiction. This was someone stating facts with the casual confidence of someone who'd lived them. Serial number 7749 Delta Whiskey 66 Alpha, she continued, her voice never rising above conversational level, but somehow filling the entire space. 8 years active duty, 3 combat deployments. Syrian Theater of Operations, Afghanistan Theater of Operations, and 1 deployment I'm not authorized to discuss in the presence of personnel lacking appropriate security clearance. Cadet Morrison's training knife wavered in his grip. Echo 7 classifications were theoretical to him. Mythical designations that appeared in the most heavily classified briefings he'd been allowed to attend during his privileged tour through various military academies. If such classifications even existed, and he was beginning to suspect they did, they indicated operational involvement in missions that never appeared in official records. Current assignment. Sarah continued, still motionless except for her lips. Internal Affairs Investigation Unit, Pentagon Special Projects Division. Investigating allegations of systematic abuse within advanced tactical training programs at select military institutions. The words hit the assembled cadets like physical blows. Internal Affairs. Pentagon Investigation. Systematic abuse. Every casual cruelty they'd inflicted over the past months. Every humiliation they'd recorded for their private entertainment. Every time they'd used their family connections to make complaints disappear. All of it suddenly recontextualized as evidence in a federal investigation. For the past 14 days, she said, her gaze still fixed on the American flag above the administration building, I have been documenting patterns of criminal behavior among cadets in the Advanced Tactical Leadership Program. Assault, battery, psychological torture, abuse of authority, conduct unbecoming, and violation of approximately 37 articles of the Uniform Code of Military Justice. Marcus felt the rifle trembling in his hands. Though whether from his own nervous tension or some fundamental shift in the reality around him, he couldn't tell. The woman they'd been tormenting, the helpless Pentagon bureaucrat they'd assumed was easy prey, was revealing herself to be something none of them had imagined possible. The rubber knife currently being held by Cadet Morrison, Sarah said, somehow knowing exactly what was happening behind her without turning around, represents the 14th separate weapons violation I've documented. The training rifle currently pressed to my skull represents the 15th, and constitutes assault with a deadly weapon under both military and federal law, regardless of ammunition type. Cadet Kim's phone slipped from his suddenly nerveless fingers, clattering on the concrete with a sound like breaking glass. The videos he'd been recording, the evidence he'd thought would provide entertainment for his social media followers, had just become exhibits in a federal prosecution that could destroy not just his military career, but his entire future. Combat record, Sarah continued, her voice taking on the rhythmic cadence of an official briefing, includes 17 confirmed enemy kills in direct action, 43 successful extractions of high-value assets from hostile territory, and leadership of task force Whisper during Operation Silent Thunder, the details of which remain classified under the National Security Act. The names meant nothing to most of the cadets, but Morrison had heard whispers of Operation Silent Thunder during a briefing his general father had allowed him to observe. It was one of those missions that existed in the gray spaces between official military records and legend, the kind of operation that only got discussed in secured rooms by people with clearances so high they made his family's political connections look like a high school student. Council, silver star with 2 clusters, she said, listing her decorations with the same casual precision someone else might use to recite a grocery list. Bronze star with V device for valor. Purple heart with 1 cluster. Navy Cross, Presidential Unit citation. And 1 medal that doesn't officially exist but was personally awarded by someone whose name I'm not authorized to mention in the presence of unauthorized personnel. Each medal represented acts of heroism and sacrifice that none of these privileged children could begin to comprehend. They'd grown up believing that service was something you put on like an expensive uniform. That valor was inherited through family connections. That honor was a privilege of birth rather than something earned through blood and sacrifice. They were wrong about everything. Primary operational specialties, Sarah said, her clinical recitation continuing like a prosecutor reading charges, include close quarters combat, weapons specialist, demolitions expert, advanced interrogation techniques, counterintelligence, and elimination of high-value targets in denied territory. The last item on her list hung in the air like a death sentence. Elimination of high-value targets. These cadets had spent their morning threatening someone who'd been professionally trained to kill enemy combatants in situations far more dangerous than anything they could imagine. Current mission parameters, she said, her voice finally shifting from the clinical tone of a briefing to something that carried the edge of barely controlled anger. Include gathering sufficient evidence to support federal prosecution of personnel involved in systematic abuse of authority within this institution. She paused, letting the implications sink in. Mission status, completed as of approximately 30 seconds ago. When Cadet Thorne pressed a weapon to my head while Cadet Morrison threatened me with a blade and the remainder of your unit documented. The assault for personal entertainment. 24. Young men suddenly understood that their lives had just changed forever. Not disciplinary action that their families could smooth over. Not embarrassing incidents that money could make disappear. But federal crimes witnessed by a Pentagon investigator with combat credentials that made their most decorated instructors look like weekend warriors. The woman they'd thought was prey had just revealed herself to be the apex predator in a game they'd never realized they were playing, and the game was about to end. The weight of Sarah's revelation settled over the training yard like a heavy blanket, but the full implications of their situation hadn't yet penetrated the cadets' shock. They stood frozen, processing the impossible transformation of their victim into something far beyond their comprehension. But their privileged backgrounds and years of consequence-free behavior still whispered that somehow this could be managed, explained away, or buried like every other incident before it. That delusion was about to die a violent death. The primary objective of this investigation, Sarah continued, her voice maintaining that same clinical precision that made every word feel like a courtroom testimony, was to determine whether reported incidents of abuse represented isolated behavioral problems or systematic institutional failure requiring federal intervention. She shifted slightly, a movement so subtle that only Marcus, with the rifle still pressed to her head, could feel it. What he interpreted as nervous tension was actually Sarah transitioning from information gathering to operational readiness. 8 years of special operations training had taught her that the moment of revelation was often the most dangerous when exposed criminals either surrendered or escalated to desperate violence. Based on 14 days of embedded observation, she said, I can now definitively conclude that Fort Blackwater's Advanced Tactical Program has become a breeding ground for criminal behavior that poses a clear and present danger to military readiness and national security. The words hit Morrison like physical blows. His father, General Patricia Morrison, had specifically chosen Fort Blackwater for his training because of its reputation for producing fast-track officers who moved quickly into positions of authority within the Pentagon hierarchy. The Morrison family name was carved into bronze plaques throughout the academy, representing 3 generations of military leadership. All of that heritage was about to become worthless. The evidence package being transmitted to Pentagon Internal Affairs as we speak, Sarah continued. And several cadets instinctively reached for phones that were no longer in their hands. Includes detailed documentation of 47 separate incidents of abuse, ranging from psychological torture of support staff to sexual harassment of visiting female instructors. Cadet Chun felt his stomach drop as he realized the implications. His father's defense contracts with the Pentagon were worth billions of dollars, but they all contained morality clauses that could void the agreements if family members were convicted of military crimes. The tech empire his father had built, the fortune that had bought Chun's way into every elite institution he'd attended, could collapse overnight if this investigation went public. Video evidence, Sarah said, her tone carrying just a hint of grim satisfaction, includes 17 hours of recorded footage obtained through surveillance equipment installed throughout the facility, as well as content recovered from personal devices, voluntarily provided by certain cadets who believed they were documenting entertainment rather than federal crimes. Kin's broken phone seemed to mock him from the concrete where it had fallen. Every video he'd recorded, every moment of cruelty he'd captured for his social media followers, had just become evidence in a federal prosecution. Worse, the cloud storage accounts where he'd automatically backed up everything meant that deleting the local copies would be meaningless. The Pentagon already had access to everything. Witness statements, Sarah continued relentlessly, have been obtained from 43 individuals, including current and former Fort Blackwater personnel, visiting instructors, support staff, and civilian contractors. These statements document a pattern of criminal behavior extending back approximately 18 months under the current command structure. The scope of the investigation was staggering. They'd assumed their behavior had gone unnoticed, that their victims were too intimidated or too powerless to complain effectively. Instead, every person they'd humiliated, every contractor they'd terrorized, every instructor they'd driven away had been providing detailed accounts to federal investigators. Physical evidence, she said, includes medical records documenting injuries sustained by personnel subjected to unauthorized training exercises, psychological evaluation reports from victims requiring treatment for trauma-related disorders, and forensic analysis of materials used in various harassment campaigns. Cadet Brooks remembered the contractor from 3 months ago, the older man they'd forced to crawl through the obstacle course while pelting him with paintball rounds. The man had ended up in the base hospital with a dislocated shoulder and severe bruising, but the incident had been classified as a training accident. Apparently, the Pentagon's investigators had taken a different view of the evidence. Financial records, Sarah continued, her systematic destruction of their world proceeding with bureaucratic precision, documenting attempts to bribe or intimidate potential witnesses, including payments made to hospital staff to alter medical reports and contributions to academy administration designed to suppress investigation of reported incidents. Morrison felt the blood drain from his face. The donations his father had made to Fort Blackwater's building fund, the informal conversations about maintaining institutional reputation, the subtle pressure applied to make certain problems disappear, all of it had been documented by investigators who understood exactly what they were looking at. Communication intercepts, she said, obtained through legally authorized surveillance warrants, include recorded conversations among cadets planning harassment campaigns, discussing methods of intimidation, and coordinating cover-up activities with family members and academy officials. Every phone call home, every text message coordination session, every whispered conversation they'd assumed was private had been monitored and recorded by federal agents with the legal authority to conduct comprehensive surveillance of military installations suspected of harboring criminal activity. The investigation has also revealed, Sarah said, her voice taking on an edge that made several cadets step back involuntarily, that this systematic abuse has been tolerated, and in some cases actively encouraged, by certain members of the Academy's command structure who believed their political connections made them untouchable. She was talking about Colonel Henderson, about Lieutenant Brooks, about the entire chain of command that had looked the other way while these spoiled children turned a military academy into their personal playground for sadistic entertainment. The corruption went far beyond a few bad cadets. It was institutional, systematic, and about to face the full weight of federal prosecution. Based on this evidence, Sarah said, arrest warrants have been prepared for 27 individuals, including current cadets, academy personnel, and civilian accomplices. These warrants will be executed immediately upon completion of this final phase of evidence gathering. The final phase. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. And suddenly every cadet in the circle understood that they weren't just witnesses to this revelation. They were participants in the final evidence collection that would complete the case against them. Everything they'd done in the past 20 minutes. Every threat they'd made, every moment of cruelty they'd inflicted while Sarah documented their behavior, had just become the capstone evidence that would ensure their federal convictions were ironclad and undeniable. The trap had been perfectly constructed, and they'd walked into it with absolute certainty of their own immunity. Their education in the real world was about to begin. The moment of truth arrived not with fanfare or dramatic announcement, but with the subtle shift of weight that every special operations warrior learns during their first week of training. Sarah's body, which had remained perfectly still throughout her methodical revelation, suddenly coiled with the controlled energy of a compressed spring, preparing to release 8 years of lethal expertise. Marcus felt the change through the rifle barrel pressed against her skull, a minute alteration in tension that his nervous system registered as dangerous, even though his conscious mind couldn't identify the threat. His finger twitched involuntarily on the trigger, a reflexive response that in actual combat would have been far too slow to matter. But this wasn't combat. This was education. Sarah moved. The sequence of events that followed happened so quickly that most of the cadets' minds couldn't process what they were seeing until it was already over. Years of special operations training had compressed into her muscle memory, the kind of explosive violence that enemy combatants in Syria and Afghanistan had learned to fear. The sudden transformation from apparent helplessness to overwhelming force that defined the difference between elite warriors and everyone else. Her left hand snapped upward with surgical precision, striking Marcus's wrist at the exact pressure point that would cause involuntary muscle relaxation. The rifle, which had seemed so threatening moments before, flew from his grasp as if it had been yanked by an invisible wire, spinning through the air in a perfect arc that spoke to the calculated force of her strike. Before the weapon had completed its first rotation, Sarah was already in motion. Her right leg swept behind Marcus's ankles while her right hand drove into his solar plexus with enough force to lift him off his feet. The combination of strikes, one high, one low, perfectly timed, sent the young man crashing to the concrete with an impact that knocked the wind from his lungs and left him gasping like a landed fish. The rifle clattered harmlessly to the ground 3 feet away, its threatening presence reduced to impotent metal and plastic. Total elapsed time, 1.7 seconds. Sarah wasn't finished. Morrison, still holding his rubber training knife and standing closest to the action, had just enough time to register that something impossible was happening before Sarah's attention turned to him. The training blade that had seemed so intimidating in his hand suddenly looked like a child's toy as he faced someone who disarmed actual terrorists with actual weapons in actual life or death situations. "Drop it," Sarah said, her voice carrying the kind of absolute authority that bypassed conscious thought and spoke directly to survival instincts. She wasn't asking, wasn't negotiating, wasn't playing the psychological games these cadets had grown accustomed to winning through privilege and intimidation. She was giving a direct order, backed by the demonstrated capability to enforce it. Morrison's hand opened involuntarily, the rubber knife falling to join the rifle on the concrete. His military training, such as it was, recognized command authority when he encountered it. Even when his ego struggled to accept the reality of the situation, the other cadets stood frozen in a tableau of shock and disbelief. Their leader was down, their weapons were neutralized, and the helpless victim they'd been tormenting had just demonstrated combat capabilities that belonged in action movies, not in their privileged reality. Kim's broken phone lay forgotten as he stared at Sarah with the wide-eyed expression of someone whose fundamental understanding of the world had just been shattered. Brooks took an involuntary step backward, his body's survival instincts finally overriding his conscious arrogance. Chun and Rodriguez exchanged glances that spoke to the dawning realization that they'd made a catastrophic error in judgment, but perhaps the most dramatic transformation was in Sarah herself. The quiet, unassuming Pentagon analyst who'd sat in their briefing rooms taking notes had completely disappeared, replaced by something these cadets had never encountered: a genuine warrior who'd earned her authority through blood, sweat, and sacrifice rather than inheriting it through family connections. Her posture was different, not the submissive stance of a victim, but the controlled readiness of a predator maintaining situational awareness. Her eyes moved constantly, tracking each cadet's position, calculating threat levels and response options, with the automatic precision of someone who'd survived firefights against enemies far more dangerous than privileged children playing soldier. Most unsettling of all was her expression. Gone was the blank, emotionless mask she'd worn throughout their torture session. In its place was something that made several cadets instinctively reach for weapons they didn't have: the cold, professional assessment of a special operations warrior evaluating targets. "Cadet Thorne," she said, looking down at Marcus, who was still struggling to regain his breath, "you've just experienced what's known as a disarming technique. In actual combat, that sequence would have been followed by a killing strike to your carotid artery. You'd have been unconscious in approximately 4 seconds and dead in 30. The clinical precision of her explanation was somehow more terrifying than any emotional outburst would have been. She was describing the mechanics of killing with the same casual tone someone else might use to explain how to change a tire. "Cadet Morrison," she continued, turning her attention to the young man who'd dropped his training knife, "the blade you were threatening me with represents approximately 47 different ways I could have killed you before you completed your threatening gesture. Would you like a demonstration of the first 5? Morrison shook his head frantically, his earlier bravado completely evaporated in the face of genuine expertise. Sarah nodded approvingly. "Good. You're beginning to understand the difference between playing soldier and being one." She took a single step forward, and 22 cadets took collective steps backward, their pack mentality completely reversed as they recognized her as the apex predator in their suddenly transformed hierarchy. "For the past 20 minutes," she said, her voice carrying across the training yard with the authority of someone accustomed to commanding in life or death situations, "you've been demonstrating for federal investigators exactly why this institution requires immediate intervention." The reminder of their legal jeopardy hit them like cold water. In their shock at witnessing her combat capabilities, they'd momentarily forgotten that every second of their behavior was being documented for criminal prosecution. "Every threat you made," Sarah continued, "every moment of cruelty you inflicted, every second of video you recorded, all of it has been witnessed by a federal agent conducting an authorized investigation into systematic criminal behavior." She gestured toward Marcus, still gasping on the concrete. "The assault you just committed against a federal agent will add approximately 15 years to your eventual sentence." The weight of their situation began to penetrate their shock. This wasn't just embarrassment or disciplinary action that their families could smooth over. This was federal prison time for crimes they'd committed. While being observed by someone with the authority to arrest them, their privileged world was ending. And the education and consequences was just beginning. The training yard had transformed into something resembling a crime scene, with 24 young men suddenly understanding that they were no longer predators, but prey caught in a trap they'd constructed themselves. The silence that followed Sarah's demonstration was profound, not the expectant quiet of an audience waiting for entertainment, but the stunned hush of people confronting the complete collapse of everything they'd believed about power, privilege, and their own invincibility. Marcus finally managed to draw a full breath, the pain in his solar plexus serving as a brutal reminder of how quickly his world had changed. From his position on the concrete, looking up at the woman who'd just dismantled him with surgical precision, he could see things his standing classmates couldn't. The micro-expressions of controlled anger on Sarah's face, the way her hands remained positioned for instant action, the professional assessment in her eyes as she evaluated each cadet as a potential continuing threat. This wasn't someone who'd gotten lucky with a surprise move. This was someone who'd spent years perfecting the art of violence, who could calculate killing angles and response times with the same ease these cadets used to plan weekend parties. "Stand up, Cadet Thorne," Sarah commanded, her voice carrying the kind of authority that made resistance literally unthinkable. Marcus struggled to his feet, every movement reminding him of the force she'd used to put him down, precisely calibrated to disable without causing permanent damage. A level of control that spoke to extensive training in non-lethal takedowns. "Look around you," she said as Marcus regained his footing. "Look at your fellow cadets. What do you see?" Marcus turned slowly, taking in the faces of young men who'd been his companions in cruelty just minutes before. What he saw was fear, not the manufactured intimidation they'd used against their victims, but genuine terror at finding themselves completely outmatched by someone they'd grossly underestimated. Brooks had gone pale, his earlier bravado replaced by the hollow-eyed stare of someone realizing their actions had consequences they'd never imagined. Kim stood frozen with his arms at his sides, his body language screaming submission to anyone trained to read such signals. Morrison, their unofficial leader, was visibly struggling not to tremble as he processed the implications of having threatened a federal agent with a weapon. "I see scared children," Marcus said quietly, the words escaping before he could stop them. "Correct," Sarah replied, her approval somehow more unsettling than her anger had been. "You see young men who've spent months playing at being soldiers without understanding what that word actually means. You see privileged children who confused family connections with personal competence, who mistook expensive equipment for expertise, who believed that wearing a uniform gave them the right to abuse anyone they perceived as weaker." She began walking slowly around the group, and Marcus noticed how each cadet instinctively turned to keep her in sight, their bodies recognizing her as a threat, even as their minds struggled to process the reversal of their situation. "But what you should see," she continued, "is 24 young men who are about to face the first real consequences of their lives. Federal charges that no amount of family influence can make disappear. Prison sentences that will follow you for the rest of your existence. The complete destruction of every privilege and advantage you've taken for granted. Cadet Walsh, who'd been one of the most vocal participants in the morning's harassment, suddenly stepped forward. "Commander, we didn't know who you were. If we'd known you were—" "Stop." Sarah's voice cut through his attempt at explanation like a blade. "Right there. Stop and listen to what you just said." Walsh's mouth snapped shut, his face flushing red as he realized his mistake. "You just told me that your behavior would have been different if you'd known my rank and qualifications," Sarah said, her tone carrying the disappointed authority of a teacher addressing a particularly dense student. "Which means you believe abuse is acceptable as long as it's directed at people you perceive as powerless." The observation hung in the air like an indictment, forcing each cadet to confront the ugly truth of their behavior. They hadn't targeted Sarah because she'd done anything wrong. They'd targeted her because they'd believed she couldn't fight back. "Let me explain something about military service that apparently wasn't covered in your advanced tactical leadership courses," Sarah said, her voice taking on the cadence of someone delivering a lesson that would never be forgotten. "The uniform you wear represents a sacred trust. It means you've sworn an oath to protect those who cannot protect themselves, to serve something greater than your own interests, to conduct yourself with honor even when no one is watching." She gestured toward their discarded weapons, toward Marcus still nursing his bruised ribs, toward the phones that had recorded their crimes. "Every person you've humiliated, every contractor you've terrorized, every support staff member you've abused, they were under the protection of that uniform. They were people who trusted that American military personnel would treat them with basic human dignity. And you violated that trust for your own entertainment." Rodriguez, the group's amateur philosopher, tried to speak up. "Commander, you were just what?" Sarah's interruption was sharp enough to make him flinch. "Following orders? Acting under stress? Defending your country? Or were you just inflicting pain on helpless people because you could?" The question demanded an honest answer that none of them could provide. There was no justification for their behavior, no military doctrine that supported terrorizing civilians, no tactical advantage gained by humiliating support staff. They'd done it because they'd enjoyed it. The real military, the one you've been pretending to belong to, has a name for people who abuse their authority for personal gratification, Sarah said. "We call them war criminals, and we court-martial them." The words hit like physical blows. War criminals, court-martial, these weren't terms associated with disciplinary action or family embarrassment. These were words that destroyed lives and sent people to military prison for decades. Your family's political connections, your trust funds, your legacy admissions to elite institutions. None of that matters when you're standing before a military tribunal, facing charges of systematic abuse under the uniform code of military justice, Sarah continued. Military law doesn't recognize wealth as a defense. It doesn't accept family influence as mitigation. It judges actions, not ancestry. Several cadets were now visibly shaking as the full scope of their situation became clear. They'd grown up believing their family names made them untouchable, that their wealth and connections provided immunity from consequences. They were discovering that some institutions still operated on merit and accountability rather than privilege and influence. "But here's what you really need to understand," Sarah said, her voice taking on a tone that somehow managed to be both compassionate and utterly implacable. "This isn't just about punishment. This is about protecting every future subordinate you might have commanded, every soldier who might have served under officers trained to believe that abuse is." "For the past 20 minutes, she said, her voice carrying across the training yard with the authority of someone accustomed to commanding in life or death situations, "you've been demonstrating for federal investigators exactly why this institution requires immediate intervention." The reminder of their legal jeopardy hit them like cold water. In their shock at witnessing her combat capabilities, they'd momentarily forgotten that every second of their behavior was being documented for criminal prosecution. "Every threat you made," Sarah continued, "every moment of cruelty you inflicted, every second of video you recorded, all of it has been witnessed by a federal agent conducting an authorized investigation into systematic criminal behavior." She gestured toward Marcus, still gasping on the concrete. "The assault you just committed against a federal agent will add approximately 15 years. The weight of her revelations had settled over them like a heavy blanket, but Sarah wasn't finished. The most important part of any military operation wasn't the tactical execution, it was the after-action assessment. The moment when participants were forced to confront not just what they'd done, but why they'd done it and what it revealed about their character. "I want each of you to think about something," Sarah said, her voice carrying the measured authority of someone who'd earned the right to be heard. "In approximately 30 minutes, federal agents will arrive to execute the arrest warrants that have been prepared based on today's evidence. Before that happens, I'm going to give you something your privileged backgrounds have never provided: a moment of genuine accountability." She gestured toward the phones scattered on the concrete, toward the weapons they'd dropped, toward Marcus, who was still pale from his encounter with her combat skills. "Look at what you've created here. Look at the evidence of your character when you believed no one was watching who mattered. This isn't aberrant behavior. This is who you really are when consequences seem impossible." Cadet Chun, his tech billionaire father's influence suddenly meaningless in the face of federal charges, found his voice. "Commander, we made mistakes. We can change. We can—" "Stop." Sarah's interruption was gentle but absolute. "Listen to your words. Mistakes. As if terrorizing helpless people was an accident, a miscalculation. Something that happened by chance rather than choice." She walked slowly toward Chun, and he instinctively stepped backward, his body recognizing predator behavior even as his mind struggled to process it. "Cadet Chun, your group has systematically abused 43 separate individuals over the past 18 months. You've recorded your crimes for entertainment. You've coordinated cover-up activities with family members. You've used your wealth and connections to suppress investigations. These aren't mistakes. They're a pattern of criminal behavior that reveals your fundamental character." The clinical precision of her words stripped away every excuse, every rationalization, every attempt to minimize what they'd done. She was forcing them to confront the truth about themselves without the protective buffer of privilege they'd always relied upon. "But here's what I want you to understand," Sarah continued, her voice taking on a tone that somehow managed to be both merciless and compassionate. "The people you've abused, the contractors, the support staff, the visiting instructors, they weren't your enemies. They weren't threats to be neutralized or obstacles to be overcome. They were fellow human beings who deserved basic dignity and respect." Morrison, still struggling with the collapse of his worldview, stepped forward. "We know that now. We understand." "No," Sarah cut him off, "you don't understand. Because if you truly understood, you never would have needed this moment. The capacity for empathy, for recognizing the humanity in others, isn't something you learn when facing consequences. It's something you either possess or you don't." The observation hit them like a physical blow because it was undeniably true. They hadn't suddenly developed consciences when confronted with Sarah's identity and capabilities. They'd simply recognized a superior predator and shifted into survival mode. "Every person you terrorized had families who loved them," Sarah said, her voice carrying the weight of someone who'd seen what real suffering looked like. "They had hopes, dreams, fears, and vulnerabilities just like you do. They felt pain, humiliation, and fear just as acutely as you're feeling it right now. But when they were suffering, you laughed." The silence that followed was heavy with the recognition of truth they couldn't deny or rationalize away. In their shock at Sarah's revelation, Several cadets had actually felt genuine fear and helplessness for the first time in their privileged lives. Now they were being forced to confront the fact that they'd deliberately inflicted those same feelings on others for entertainment. "I've served with real warriors," Sarah continued. "Men and women who faced enemy fire, who've made life or death decisions under unimaginable pressure, who've sacrificed everything for their duty and their honor. And do you know what every single one of them understood that you don't?" She waited, but none of the cadets dared to answer. They understood that true strength protects the vulnerable, that real authority serves others, not itself, that honor means doing the right thing especially when it's difficult, especially when no one is watching, especially when there's no reward for doing so. Cadet Brooks, who'd been one of the most enthusiastic participants in the morning's abuse, suddenly spoke up. "How do we fix this? How do we make it right?" Sarah studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "You don't. Some things can't be fixed, Cadet Brooks. Some damage is permanent. Some trust, once broken, can never be repaired." The finality of her words hit them like a death sentence. They'd grown up believing that money, influence, and family connections could solve any problem, that consequences were temporary inconveniences rather than permanent realities. "But," Sarah continued, and the word hung in the air like a lifeline, "you can ensure that your failures serve a purpose beyond self-destruction. You can become examples, cautionary, tales that prevent others from making the same. Choices." She gestured toward the approaching sound of vehicles. The federal agents arriving to execute their arrests. "Your military careers are over. Your privileged positions are forfeit. Your family's reputations will be tarnished by association with your crimes. But you can choose how your story ends." The sound of car doors slamming echoed across the training yard as federal agents began their approach to the academy's main building. "You can spend the next several years in military prison raging against the injustice of facing consequences for your actions," Sarah said. "Or you can use that time to develop the empathy and character you should have possessed from the beginning." Marcus, still nursing his bruised ribs, looked up at her with something that might have been the beginning of genuine remorse. "Will anyone ever trust us again?" Sarah's expression softened slightly, revealing a hint of the compassion that motivated genuine leaders. "Trust isn't given, Cadet Thorne. It's earned. And earning it requires demonstrating, through consistent actions over extended time, that you've fundamentally changed who you are." The federal agents were crossing the training yard now, their professional demeanor and federal credentials representing the moment when consequence became reality. "The question you need to ask yourselves," Sarah said as the agents approached, "is whether you're capable of that kind of change, or whether you'll spend the rest of your lives blaming others for the choices you made when you thought no one important was watching." The education was nearly complete, but the final lesson would take years to fully understand. The federal agents moved across the training yard with the practiced efficiency of professionals who'd conducted countless arrests, their black SUVs forming a perimeter that transformed Fort Blackwater's prestigious academy into what looked remarkably like a crime scene. Agent Rebecca Martinez, a 20-year veteran of military criminal investigations, approached the group with the measured confidence of someone who'd seen every possible variation of privilege, trying to escape consequences. "Commander Chun," Agent Martinez said, offering a respectful nod to Sarah while maintaining visual contact with the assembled cadets. "We have the warrants and transport ready. Are you prepared to conclude the operation?" The formal language carried weight beyond its simple meaning. This wasn't just the arrest of some troublemaking cadets. This was the culmination of a federal investigation that would reshape how the military handled institutional abuse. Every word, every procedure, Every moment was being documented for what would inevitably become a landmark case in military justice. Sarah nodded once, her expression shifting back to the professional mask she'd worn for 2 weeks of gathering evidence. All suspects are accounted for and secured. Evidence collection is complete. You may proceed with arrests. The casual authority in her voice struck the cadets with fresh force. While they'd been playing their cruel games, she'd been coordinating with federal agents, building cases, and preparing for this exact moment. Their amateur-hour intimidation tactics had been performed before an audience of one person who outranked most of the officers on the base and possessed the legal authority to destroy their lives. Agent Martinez stepped forward, her voice carrying across the training yard with the kind of formal authority that made resistance impossible. By order of the United States Attorney for the Eastern District, I am placing the following individuals under arrest for violations of the Uniform Code of Military Justice, federal assault statutes, and conspiracy to obstruct justice. The reading of names began like a roll call of shame. Marcus James Thorne. Marcus stepped forward mechanically, his body moving without conscious thought as Agent Martinez continued. You are charged with assault on a federal officer, conspiracy to commit assault, and conduct unbecoming. You have the right to remain silent. The Miranda warning that followed was delivered with bureaucratic precision, each word carrying the weight of constitutional protection that these privileged young men had never needed to understand. As Agent Martinez spoke, Marcus felt handcuffs clicking around his wrists, not the plastic zip ties used in training exercises, but real steel restraints that marked his transition from cadet to criminal defendant. Jake Morrison. Morrison's name echoed off the concrete walls like a judgment. His father's 3-star rank, his family's military heritage, his legacy admission to every elite institution he'd attended. None of it mattered as he was processed like any other criminal facing federal charges. The pattern continued with mechanical efficiency. Brian Kovac, David Kim, Tyler Brooks. Each name represented another family about to discover that political influence and financial power had limits when confronted with documented federal crimes, but perhaps most striking was the transformation in the cadets themselves as reality settled over them like a heavy shroud. The pack mentality that had made them so vicious when they believed themselves untouchable had completely evaporated. Now they stood as individuals facing the consequences of choices they'd made collectively. Each young man suddenly alone with the wreckage of his future. Cadet Walsh, whose family owned defense contracts worth hundreds of millions, found himself weeping silently as the handcuffs closed around his wrists. The tears weren't from physical pain, but from the dawning recognition that his privileged existence was ending forever. No amount of family money could buy his way out of federal prison. No political connection could erase video evidence of his crimes. Rodriguez, the amateur philosopher who'd theorized about psychological breakdown in others, experienced his own moment of cognitive collapse as he was read his rights. All his intellectual pretensions, his sophisticated theories about human behavior, his belief in his own superior understanding, all of it crumbled when confronted with the simple reality that actions have consequences. Chun's arrest carried particular weight because of his father's Pentagon contracts. The tech billionaire who'd bought his son's way into every elite institution would soon discover that federal morality clauses could void agreements worth billions. The family fortune built on defense work would be jeopardized by a son's criminal conviction for abusing military personnel. But the most dramatic transformation was in Morrison. As the unofficial leader of their group, he'd basked in the respect and fear of his fellow cadets, secure in the knowledge that his general father's influence made him untouchable. Now, as Agent Martinez read him his rights, Morrison realized that military law didn't recognize family privilege as a defense against criminal behavior. Sarah watched the Proceedings with the professional. Detachment of someone who'd seen justice served. In far more dramatic circumstances. She'd witnessed the arrest of war criminals, the capture of terrorist leaders, the apprehension of traitors who'd sold state secrets to enemy governments. By comparison, the arrest of 24 privileged children was routine paperwork, yet there was something profoundly satisfying about this particular moment. These young men represented everything wrong with institutional military culture, the belief that authority justified abuse, that privilege granted immunity from consequences, that wearing a uniform was permission to terrorize those perceived as weaker. Their arrests wouldn't just punish individual crimes. They would send a message throughout the military hierarchy that systematic abuse would face systematic consequences, regardless of the perpetrator's family connections or political influence. Commander Chun, Agent Martinez said as the last of the cadets was processed, "We'll need your testimony for the preliminary hearings. But the evidence package you've provided should be sufficient for conviction on all major charges." Sarah nodded, already mentally shifting to the paperwork and testimony that would ensure these convictions stuck. The investigation was concluding, but the real work of reform was just beginning. As the federal agents loaded their prisoners into transport vehicles, Sarah remained in the training yard, looking up at the American flag that still flew above the administration building. The flag represented ideals that these cadets had dishonored, principles they'd violated, and promises they'd broken, but it also represented the possibility of redemption, the chance for institutions to reform themselves, and the hope that future officers might learn honor before they learned power. The education was complete, but the lessons would echo through the military for years to come. 6 months later, the transformation of Fort Blackwater had become the subject of military academy case studies across the nation. The scandal that had erupted from Sarah's investigation had sent shockwaves through the Pentagon, resulting in congressional hearings, policy reforms, and a complete restructuring of how elite military institutions monitored and prevented abuse. What had once been a breeding ground for entitled cruelty had become a model for accountability and genuine leadership development. The advanced tactical program had been completely disbanded, its curriculum scrapped, and its leadership replaced with officers who understood that military authority meant service, not domination. The new commandant, Colonel Patricia Reeves, was a decorated combat veteran who'd served alongside Sarah in Afghanistan and shared her uncompromising standards for military conduct. Under her leadership, Fort Blackwater had implemented revolutionary changes that prioritized character development. Alongside tactical training, the physical changes to the academy were immediately visible. The bronze plaque celebrating wealthy donor families had been removed and replaced with memorials, honoring enlisted soldiers who died in service. The luxurious amenities that had pampered privileged cadets were converted into study halls and community service centers where future officers learned to support their communities rather than exploit them. Most significantly, the academy now required all cadets to spend their first year serving in support roles, working in kitchens, maintaining facilities, and assisting the civilian staff they'd once been taught to view as inferior. Sarah stood in what had once been the training yard, where her confrontation with the cadets had taken place, now transformed into a memorial garden honoring military personnel who died protecting others. The concrete walls where cruel laughter had echoed were covered with ivy, and the space where Marcus had held a rifle to her head now featured a fountain dedicated to courage and sacrifice. The legal proceedings had unfolded exactly as she'd predicted. Despite their families' desperate attempts to minimize consequences, all 24 cadets had been convicted on federal charges. The video evidence, witness testimony, and documented pattern of abuse had made their guilt undeniable. Marcus Thorne received 8 years in military prison, his sentence enhanced by the assault on a federal officer. Morrison got 10 years, his leadership role in the conspiracy adding to his punishment. The others received sentences ranging from 5 to 12 years, ensuring that none would ever serve in positions of military authority. But perhaps more importantly, their convictions had triggered investigations at 17 other military academies where similar patterns of abuse had been suspected but never proven. The ripple effects of Sarah's investigation had exposed a systemic problem that reached far beyond Fort Blackwater, leading to reforms that would protect thousands of future military personnel from the kind of institutional cruelty these cadets had represented. Families of the convicted cadets had faced their own reckonings. General Morrison had resigned in disgrace when his attempts to interfere with the investigation became public knowledge. Chun's father had lost billions in canceled defense contracts when morality clauses were triggered by his son's conviction. Several other families had seen their political careers and business empires crumble as their connections to systematic abuse became public record. Sarah's role in the investigation had remained largely classified, her identity protected by the same security protocols that governed all special operations personnel. Officially, she was still listed as a Pentagon analyst conducting routine evaluations. Unofficially, she'd become a legend within military law enforcement circles, the operator who'd single-handedly exposed and dismantled a corruption network that had operated with impunity for years. The broader impact of the Fort Blackwater scandal had reshaped military culture in ways that extended far beyond elite academies. New protocols required psychological evaluations for all officer candidates, focusing specifically on empathy, ethical reasoning, and respect for human dignity. Training programs now included extensive education about the historical consequences of military abuse, using examples from Abu Ghraib to My Lai to illustrate how institutional tolerance for cruelty could destroy military effectiveness and national honor. Most significantly, the Pentagon had established the Sarah Chun Protocol, though publicly it was called the Military Ethics Oversight Program, which embedded undercover investigators in military institutions suspected of harboring abusive cultures. The program had already identified and dismantled 12 separate networks of institutional abuse, preventing countless future victims from experiencing the kind of systematic cruelty that had characterized Fort Blackwater's advanced program. Sarah's personal journey since the investigation reflected the complex nature of justice and redemption. She'd testified before congressional committees, her classified testimony providing lawmakers with the detailed evidence they needed to pass comprehensive military reform legislation. Her recommendations had become policy at the highest levels of military command, ensuring that future investigations would have the resources and authority needed to prevent institutional cover-ups. Yet she'd also maintained contact with several of the convicted cadets, monitoring their progress through the military prison system and evaluating their potential for genuine rehabilitation. Marcus Thorne had shown the most promise, using his time in confinement to earn a degree in social work and develop what appeared to be authentic remorse for his actions. Morrison remained defiant and bitter, his sense of entitlement apparently unshaken by consequence. The others fell somewhere between these extremes, their paths toward redemption or permanent criminality still being determined. The memorial garden where Sarah now stood represented something larger than the end of one investigation or the punishment of specific criminals. It symbolized the possibility that institutions could reform themselves, that cultures could change, and that the ideals represented by military service could triumph over the corruption that privileged background sometimes fostered. As the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the memorial fountain, Sarah reflected on the broader lessons of the Fort Blackwater investigation. Military power, like all authority, carried with it the sacred responsibility to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. When that power was corrupted by privilege, entitlement, and cruelty, It became a threat to the very values it was supposed to defend. The young men who'd terrorized innocent people for their entertainment had learned that consequences were real, that justice could reach even the most protected individuals, and that character mattered more than connections. Their education had come at a tremendous cost to themselves, their families, and the institution they'd dishonored, but it had also prevented immeasurable future suffering by eliminating them from positions where they could have abused others. The flag still flew above Fort Blackwater, but now it represented something worthy of respect, an institution committed to developing leaders who understood that true strength meant protecting the vulnerable, that real authority served others rather than itself, and that honor was earned through sacrifice rather than inherited through privilege. Sarah's mission was complete, but her work continued. Somewhere else, in another institution, other investigators were conducting their own evaluations, gathering their own evidence, and preparing their own moments of reckoning for those who believed privilege made them untouchable. The education never ended, but neither did the hope for genuine reform. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.